Greetings, dear viewers. Today we'll be discussing two horrifying cases that reveal the darkest sides of human nature. Show your support by liking and subscribing to my channel, and let's begin. Have you ever heard of the spell Skitoki Mekitokus, which is said to attract countless women? Can you even believe such a thing? As unbelievable as it sounds, there was a man in Japan who allegedly used this spell to win the hearts of women and live a life of polygamy. And yes, this all happened in 2023. So let's dive into today's story. Early in the morning at 6 a.m. on February 7th, 2023, while most residents were still fast asleep, a true commotion erupted in the city of Higashiyamato, located in Tokyo's metropolitan prefecture. A group of police officers suddenly appeared outside a three-story mansion, swiftly surrounding it in a tight formation. Moments later, a man was escorted out of the house under strict police supervision. Surprisingly, the man escorted out of the house was an elderly gentleman. 74-year-old Shibuya Hiroo stood before the cameras, his forehead adorned with a mysterious, ominous marking that sent an unsettling chill through those who saw it. This man claimed to be a prophet, someone who foretold the destinies of others. However, the accusations against Hiroo were far from mystical. They involved an attempted assault on a minor. The full story, as it unraveled, was more absurd and bizarre than anyone could imagine. The incident in question had taken place about 2 months earlier, in December 2022. On the 22nd, Hiroo had a legal wife, 43-year-old Shibuya Chiaki. At the time, she worked at a Korean restaurant. That day, Chiaki mentioned to one of her colleagues, a young girl named A, who was only about 10 years old, that she knew a great fortune teller and invited her to come over to her house. Intrigued, A agreed without hesitation to accompany Chiaki. When they entered the house, Hiroo was already there waiting for them. Without warning, he asked the young girl if she believed in the existence of extraterrestrials. Then he started talking about how UFOs actually exist. After that, Hiroo forced girl A to watch videos on the topic for an agonizing 6 hours. As the hours passed, A grew increasingly uncomfortable and tried to leave, but escaping proved to be no simple task. Hiroo began to intimidate her, saying, "You saw it, didn't you? If the aliens take you, they'll skin you alive and eat you." He surrounded her with an atmosphere of fear and dread. But the most shocking part was what he said next. "If you don't want to die, you have to sleep with me." It was an utterly outrageous and absurd demand. Hiroo's behavior became even more insistent. He continued to manipulate the young girl, insisting that he was someone extraordinary. Hiroo continued to flaunt his so-called uniqueness. From somewhere, he produced a membership card from a UFO-related organization and showed it to the girl. Imagine how terrified she must have been. At one point, teetering on the edge of assault, A managed to escape from the house. But Hiroo's threats didn't end there. He warned her, "If you go to the police, it will only get worse for you." Once home, the girl trembled with fear for a long time, keeping the terrifying incident to herself. However, after much reflection, she found the courage to confide in her family. With their support, she made the brave decision to report the incident to the police, setting the wheels of justice in motion. When the police arrived at Hiroo's house, he attempted to evade arrest by spraying pepper spray and resisting capture. This moment was described as especially pitiful and humiliating for him. Soon, news of the incident reached the media. The fact that a 70-year-old fortune teller had lured a minor with the intent to commit assault sparked widespread public outrage and disgust. However, there was another suspicious element in the story: his accomplice, 40-year-old Shibuya Chiaki. Upon closer examination of their relationship, it was revealed that Hiroo and Chiaki had been married in the past, but were divorced at the time of the incident. So, Chiaki was Hiroo's ex-wife, yet despite their divorce, they continued to live together. A situation that seemed odd on its own. Considering their nearly 30-year age difference, it raises an unsettling question. Why did Chiaki remain by the side of her 70-year-old ex-husband and actively assist him in his crimes? The answer to this question became clear through the revelations about Hiroo. It turned out that 17 years earlier, in 2006, he had been the prime suspect in another high-profile crime that shocked all of Japan. In January of that year, a young woman in her 20s reported to the police that she was being threatened by a man. She explained that, following advice from an acquaintance who vouched for the powers of a strong fortune teller, she visited a private house, later revealed to be Hirohito's residence, infamously known as the House of Hiroo. While at the house, the woman was subjected to ominous statements by the so-called fortune teller. He hinted at a curse or tragic fate hanging over her, setting the stage for events to take a terrifying turn. He foretold a horrifying event, the imminent death of her boyfriend. The terrified woman, not knowing what else to do, asked how she could prevent this tragedy. His response was shocking. "To save your boyfriend, you must sleep with me." Hirohito went as far as to make absurd claims, stating that his semen supposedly held the power to save lives. Naturally, the woman didn't believe such nonsense. She tried to leave the house, but Hirohito grabbed her, refusing to let her go. The situation grew increasingly threatening, her fear escalating with every moment. He continued to intimidate her, warning that if she left right then, she would either die or end up in a serious accident. Despite the immense pressure, the woman managed, with great difficulty, to escape from the House of Hiroo, and immediately went to the police. However, what the authorities uncovered inside Hirohito's house was even more shocking. At the time, the 57-year-old Hirohito was living in the house with 11 women. And these were not just neighbors or random tenants. Investigations revealed that he had maintained relationships with all of them through a series of sham marriages and divorces, creating a twisted hierarchy centered around himself. Even more disturbing, some of these women were revealed to have already borne his children. The most astonishing aspect was that none of these women expressed dissatisfaction with their bizarre family life. They were entirely subjugated to Hirohito, living in a tightly knit group completely isolated from the outside world. This raises the haunting question: how could such an unusual and frightening collective form? In his youth, Shibuya Hiroo was an entirely ordinary man. He worked as a sales representative for a company and married in 1974. For 25 years, he lived a conventional married life, raising 2 children and maintaining a seemingly normal household. However, in 1999, his wife became involved in a cult, leading to their divorce. It was after this that Hirohito began to change. He decided, "If I'm divorced, I'll live the way I want." But his choice was anything but ordinary. Everything began with a memory, something that had left a deep impression on him during his teenage years. This idea came to Hirohito after watching an animated series where a man lived with 10 women in a harem arrangement. Inspired, Hirohito decided to create his own harem. In April 2000, with no qualifications or special expertise, he suddenly began working as a fortune teller. He named his house the House of Hiroo, and simultaneously announced that he was seeking a secretary to assist him. Young women, innocently searching for work, would arrive for interviews without suspecting anything. It was during these encounters that Hirohito began using his manipulative tactics. He frightened them with claims that if they didn't stay in his house, they would fall victim to aliens. He then followed up with absurd statements such as, "My seed holds the power to save you from hell." He began manipulating women through cunning gaslighting techniques. Initially, he likely avoided direct threats. It simply wouldn't have worked. Instead, Hirohito presented himself as friendly, offering help and showing feigned concern for them. It was during this phase that he skillfully began to ensnare them, creating an illusion of his importance and indispensability. Inside his house, investigators discovered numerous books on hypnosis, suggesting that he may have also employed hypnotic techniques to deepen his control over the women. Gradually, and tragically, his manipulation began to take effect. The women started to fall under his influence, staying in the House of Hiroo and forming a commune-like existence. First there was 1, then 2, 3, 4. The numbers quickly grew. In Japan, where polygamy is prohibited, Hirohito found a way to circumvent the law. He repeatedly married different women and then divorced them, aiming to accumulate as many former wives as possible. The duration of these marriages was exceptionally short, on average around 50 days. In some cases, the marriage lasted only 9 days. Yet even after divorce, most of the women continued to live with Hirohito under the same roof. It's impossible not to wonder how he managed to convince so many people to accept such an unusual way of life. Even the police, perplexed by the situation during their investigation, decided to ask him directly. In response, Hirohito shared his methodology. Here's what he revealed about how he managed to manipulate so many individuals. He stated, "I had a dream where I received a spell to gain popularity. All I had to do was say Skitoki Mekitoki S, and women naturally started being drawn to me." This absurd justification sparked a significant reaction in Japanese society, becoming a topic of heated debate. Experts believe that Hirohito possessed an exceptional ability to understand human psychology. He had honed this skill over years of working in sales and later as a fortune teller. He had a deep understanding of how to dominate others' wills through manipulation. The unique aspect of his methods was his talent for amplifying the anxieties and fears of his victims. As a result, he made his victims rely on him as their sole source of support. His everyday life was carefully crafted to cultivate a sinister atmosphere. Hirohito always kept the curtains in his house closed, wore a black headpiece, and maintained an air of mystery. On his table, there was always a crystal ball, further amplifying the aura of mysticism. In this setting, he regularly performed fortune-telling sessions for the women. These always ended the same way. "You are cursed. To banish the evil spirits, you must live with me." He also threatened them, "If you tell anyone about this, you'll either fall seriously ill or die in an accident." These ominous declarations helped him brainwash the women, turning them into his obedient wives. The number of such women continued to grow, and over time, Hirohito's household transformed into a full-blown cult centered around him. But the question arises, why didn't any of these women ever go to the police? Many believed it was due to fear of Hirohito's threats. However, as it turned out, the reality was different. Surprisingly, the women living in this commune had no desire to escape. After being subjected to Hirohito's influence for so long, they had completely lost the will to resist. Their minds had been so thoroughly broken by constant manipulation that they could no longer envision life outside this closed-off world. What's particularly noteworthy is that all these women shared one common trait. Horoscopes, fortune-telling, these were sacred to them. They blindly trusted a man who proclaimed himself a seer, almost revering him as a cult leader. However, their lives were surprisingly stable. The women voluntarily established communal rules, while Hirohito himself assigned houses and land to his wives, a system that played a crucial role in sustaining their existence. Each month, the women were required to give Hirohito 800,000 won as part of a so-called communal fee. To meet this amount, they worked tirelessly every day. Every morning, they left for work together. Neighbors recalled them as hardworking, like a swarm of industrious bees. They always wore hats, hoods, and masks that completely covered their faces, traveling by bicycle or in minivans. Their faces appeared utterly lifeless, like rehearsed masks devoid of emotion. Those who didn't go out to work stayed home, dividing household chores among themselves. Every day, they washed an astonishing amount of laundry. During this time, those who didn't work outside the house took care of the children. However, the only person in the household who did no work at all was Shibuya Hiroo himself. He lived a life of comfort, supported entirely by the efforts of the women who called themselves his wives. Hirohito imposed several strict rules. The wives were required to keep their hair long, reaching down to their waists, and wear clothing that resembled miniskirts. Leaving the house after 5 p.m. was strictly forbidden. According to him, it was too dangerous. At 7 p.m. sharp, everyone was required to gather around the communal table for dinner, maintaining a rigidly structured daily routine. Their way of life appeared relatively stable. Thanks to the women's tireless efforts, the family achieved a certain level of prosperity. They could afford trips to Hawaii, and the children who reached school age were enrolled in expensive international schools. However, not everything was as smooth as it seemed. Some families began to worry about their daughters, who, while still very young, had become entangled in this strange union. Some parents even visited the so-called House of Hiroo in person to find out what was going on. Their concern grew stronger when they learned that women in their 20s were marrying a man who was already over 50. Sometimes the situation escalated to involve outright polygamy and communal living, something no parent could ever accept. However, when concerned families tried to take their daughters away, the young women categorically refused to leave. As a result, the parents, unable to persuade them, were forced to leave empty-handed. It seemed that the women living in the House of Hiroo had come to view it as a safe haven, further solidifying their reluctance to abandon it. The true nature of the House of Hiroo came to light only in 2006, when one of the wives filed a report claiming that Hirohito had been threatening her. As a result, Shibuya Hiroo was convicted of making threats and coercion. The court sentenced him to 1 year and 6 months of imprisonment, suspended for 4 years. However, surprisingly, little changed after this. Hirohito claimed that he had supposedly offered the women the chance to return to their families and live independently. The women refused to leave the house. Of the 11 women considered Hirohito's wives, only 2 left, while the rest continued living together. In this way, Hirohito managed to sustain this bizarre coexistence for 17 years, all the way until 2023. At the time, numerous media outlets attempted to interview the women to understand their motives. When asked why they had married Hirohito, their answers were nearly identical. He never lies. He can be trusted. However, the truth was far darker. The women had been completely brainwashed by his words, to the point where they genuinely believed that if they didn't have intimate relations with him, they would be eaten by aliens. This reflects the deep psychological manipulation typical of cult victims, who are entirely ensnared by their leader's control. Even if the women didn't fully grasp the truth, it does not absolve them of their involvement in the crimes. Furthermore, as with the previously arrested Chiaki, their participation in luring new young girls into the community and creating additional victims only deepened the problem. Hirohito was nothing more than a criminal who used manipulation and threats to fulfill his desires, turning women into prisoners of his influence. As for the punishments for Shibuya Hirohito and Shibuya Chiaki, the details remain unclear for now. For a time, the Japanese press referred to Hirohito as the man with a harem, using this provocative nickname in their reports. Some men even saw him as a hero who had realized their fantasies. However, in truth, he was nothing but a perverse criminal who ruthlessly exploited both minors and adult women alike. Stay with me, the second story is coming up, and it's just as shocking. Let me know in the comments what you think about the first story. Your thoughts always mean a lot to me. On August 8, 2009, a grand funeral took place in Sydney's Olympic Park, attended by over 3,000 people. Among the attendees were high-ranking Chinese diplomats, including the Consul General of China in Sydney, as well as the Minister of Justice from the Huizhou region, who delivered a farewell speech. But who was the deceased, honored with such distinction and mourning? As the funeral procession unfolded, one coffin after another began to arrive. In total, there were 5. That day, Sydney hosted a farewell ceremony for the victims of one of the most brutal slayings in history, a mass murder of a family. Norman Lim, a 45-year-old family patriarch and father of 3, was a Chinese immigrant who moved to Australia in 1989. It was here that Norman met and married his wife Lily, also a Chinese immigrant. The couple had 3 children: 15-year-old daughter Brenda, 12-year-old son Henry, and 9-year-old youngest son Terry. Together, they lived as a happy and close-knit family. However, life for Chinese immigrants in Australia, particularly in Hurstville, was far from easy. Yet Norman and Lily always strived to provide their children with a high level of education and decent living conditions. They ran a small shop, akin to a Korean mini-market, which rarely closed on weekends or holidays. Through years of relentless hard work, this modest business began to yield a stable income, allowing the family to ascend to a new standard of living. With the savings they accumulated, Norman and Lily were even able to invite other relatives from China to join them in Australia, helping them establish a life abroad. Thus, Norman's parents, his younger sister Casey, and her husband Robert moved to Sydney. The families were so close that Casey and her husband settled literally across the street from Norman and Lily. Casey also lent a hand in the family store, working part-time and supporting her brother and his wife. In addition, Norman never forgot to lend a hand to his wife's family. Lily's younger sister, Irene, had arrived in Sydney a year earlier on a student visa to attend university, even though she was already 39 years old. She too lived in the house with Norman and Lily, and thus the 2 large families supported each other through the challenging immigrant life. This continued until July 17, 2009, when the entire family gathered for dinner at Norman's parents' home, located about a 30-minute drive away. These family dinners were a Friday tradition. However, this time, one person was missing from the table: Norman's 15-year-old daughter, Brenda, who was on a school trip to France. None of those present could have imagined that this evening would be their last together. After a joyful meal, the family spent the rest of the night talking and enjoying each other's company. Everyone returned home late at night. The next morning, on Saturday, July 18th, Norman's younger sister, Casey, received a call from a regular customer of their store. He reported that the shop was closed. Casey hurried to the store and confirmed that the door was indeed locked. Stacks of undelivered newspapers lay in front of the entrance, which seemed very strange. Norman always arrived at work early without taking any days off, and opened the store on time. Worried, Casey and her husband Robert headed to Norman's house. No matter how many times they rang the doorbell or knocked, the house was as silent as a grave. Fortunately, Casey had a spare key to the house. When she unlocked the door and stepped inside, an unnatural silence filled the living room. She called out for her brother by name, but there was no response. They decided to head upstairs. Just as Casey made her way toward the staircase, she noticed the first traces of blood on the wall. Her heart skipped a beat with a premonition of something dreadful. As she climbed higher, the bloodstains became more pronounced. By the time she and Robert, now visibly anxious, reached the second floor, their worst fears were confirmed. The second floor held 4 rooms, and the door to Norman and his wife Lily's bedroom was ajar. Through the opening, bloody smears on the walls and ceiling were visible. Blood was everywhere, literally flooding the room. But this was only the first shock. When Casey peeked into the adjacent room, she was met with the same horrific scene. The walls, the furniture, everything was covered in blood. The same scene repeated in every room. The younger sister was so stunned that she fumbled to open the doors properly. The horror escalated with each passing minute, and they realized something incredible and terrifying had occurred. Overcome with terror, Casey rushed to call the police. Shortly after, at 9:50 a.m., the police arrived at the scene. Upon inspecting the house, they discovered 5 bodies. Among the deceased were Norman, his wife Lily, their younger sons Henry and Terry, and Lily's sister Irene. Except for the eldest daughter, Brenda, who was away on a school trip, everyone in the house had been brutally killed that night. The victims' bodies were found near their bedrooms, and the bloodstains and horrific wounds on their bodies indicated they had been struck with a blunt object. The faces of the 4 victims, except for Norman, were so severely disfigured by the brutal blows that they were unrecognizable. This was particularly shocking regarding the children. Why did the killer unleash such cruelty on innocent children? The autopsy results revealed that Henry and Terry had defensive wounds on their hands, indicating they had fought desperately for their lives. It is believed that the children awoke to the sounds of chaos and were attacked as they attempted to defend themselves. Moreover, after the initial attack, the children may have clung to life for 1 or 2 agonizing hours before succumbing to their injuries. Based on the crime scene evidence, police theorized that the killer began with the adults, dispatching them one by one, before turning his attention to the children. It is possible that he feared if he targeted the children first, the adults might awaken and resist. The Norman family, despite owning a modest shop, had a thriving business with an annual sales volume reaching $1 billion. This success allowed Norman to support his entire family. He had also brought over his parents from China, along with his sister and her husband, and his wife's younger brother. Initially, the police considered robbery and murder as a motive to seize the Lim family's assets. However, inconsistencies arose. There were no signs of forced entry, and most crucially, nothing was missing from the house. Cash and valuables remained untouched. There were no indications that anything had been searched for within the home. So, was this a premeditated murder? Meanwhile, the police stumbled upon another significant clue. It appeared the perpetrator had left behind traces: bloody footprints and handprints. These were found on doorknobs in every room, except for one, the daughter Brenda's room, which remained untouched, with no signs of entry. It seemed as if the intruder knew in advance that she would not be home and did not even attempt to open the door. This raises a chilling question. Did the killer have intimate knowledge of the layout of the couple's bedroom and the children's rooms, as well as the fact that the eldest daughter Brenda was away on a school trip? Doesn't this suggest that the murderer was someone very close, Someone who knew this information ahead of time? The police began to consider the possibility that the perpetrator might have been acquainted with the family, but the investigation did not yield quick results, and the mystery of the case remained unsolved. As for Brenda, the 15-year-old daughter who was the sole survivor, she was in France on a school trip when she learned of the tragedy. Upon hearing the news that her family had been killed, she immediately cut her trip short and returned to Australia. Her pain and despair were indescribable. She cried as if she had lost everything. The family's funeral concluded, and now only her Aunt Casey and her husband could take care of Brenda. Thus, Brenda was able to cope with her grief under her aunt's protection. Someone with a clear plan carried out this rare crime, brutally killing 5 family members with a blunt object in a single night. However, the culprit was never brought to justice. Without being able to grasp what had truly happened, everyone feared that this case might become yet another unsolved tragedy, as often occurs in America. On May 5, 2011, 2 years after the incident, the police finally named a suspect in the case. It turned out to be Casey's husband, Robert, Norman's brother-in-law and the uncle of the murdered children. Ironically, he was the one who survived. But on what grounds could the police suspect Robert of committing this crime? First of all, investigators noted the absence of any signs of forced entry. This indicated that the door was either opened from the inside or someone entered with a key. The entire Norman family was found in their beds, which suggested that the perpetrator intentionally opened the front door, went into the bedrooms, and attacked them. This raises the question, who had access to the house keys? Norman's parents lived 30 minutes away, while his sister Casey and her husband Robert lived just across the street. They had spare keys for emergencies. In fact, Robert had already been under suspicion 2 years prior, but on the day of the murders, his wife Casey confirmed her husband's alibi, and he was quickly cleared from the list of suspects. However, as time passed and the investigation hit a dead end, the police decided to re-examine all the details, including the call Casey made on the day of the crime. A more thorough analysis of this information began, and then a very suspicious piece of evidence emerged. Robert's voice was heard during a conversation in Chinese with Casey, his wife. It wasn't entirely clear what he was saying, but Casey, in tears, was pleading with Robert. "Darling, I'm so scared. I'm even more frightened than you. Please don't leave me alone, don't go." Where was Robert planning to go? The police set out to question Casey in more detail about the events of that day. That's when a crucial fact came to light. On the day of the murder, right at the crime scene, Robert suddenly left the house, stating that he needed to pick up his parents. When the police checked this, it turned out that Robert was indeed at the ominous location where his relatives were killed, behaving extremely oddly when he brought his in-laws to the scene of the tragedy. No matter how close family ties might be, was it really necessary to bring his parents to the site of such a brutal murder? It looked extremely suspicious. However, this wasn't the only red flag. After the funeral, Robert unexpectedly took custody of the sole surviving family member, Brenda. This marked the beginning of long legal battles with his in-laws over custody of the girl. Robert decided to fight in court, even hiring expensive lawyers, and eventually succeeded in obtaining custody. It makes one wonder, why would Robert, with living grandparents, take on the responsibility of raising her? At that time, Brenda was only 15 years old, and the estate left by her deceased parents was supposed to pass to her, right? But in practice, the inheritance was transferred to the lawful guardian, who became Robert. The police launched a new investigation, as Robert had a potentially obvious motive for murder: money. Meanwhile, the testimonies of Casey, who first discovered the bodies, and her husband Robert began to diverge. What was going on? On the day they arrived at the crime scene, Casey was the first to peek into the room through the slightly open door and saw 4 bodies. However, later during questioning, Robert claimed to have seen 5 bodies. In truth, from their position on the stairs through the ajar door, only 4 bodies could be seen. Norman's body was covered with a blanket and couldn't be seen from outside. So how did Robert know that all 5 were dead? It now becomes clear why the police started considering Robert as the main suspect. But these were all just circumstantial clues. There was no direct evidence that he personally killed his family with a blunt object. There were no physical pieces of evidence. And so, the police devised a cunning plan. Since Brenda, the sole survivor, was living with Robert, they decided to install hidden cameras in Robert's home under the pretense of protecting her. Although I'm not familiar with Australian laws, it seems that in certain situations, surveillance cameras can be installed in a suspect's home. A month after the cameras were set up, in June 2010, no suspicious activities had been recorded. The police then decided to leak some information through his wife, Casey. They informed her that footprints of Asics brand shoes had been found at the crime scene. Did this information reach Robert? That very night, the cameras in his house captured something quite remarkable. Robert took a box of Asics shoes he owned and began carefully cutting it up with scissors. Then he submerged the scraps in a bucket of water. The paper became completely soaked, and Robert flushed it down the toilet. Notably, Robert usually wore Asics shoes, and the prints found at the crime scene matched his size exactly. These surveillance camera footage became pivotal for the police, who immediately named him as the prime suspect. Robert's house was swiftly cordoned off and searches for evidence commenced. During the search, police discovered a barely noticeable bloodstain about 6 mm in size in the garage. DNA analysis revealed it was a mixture from 4 different individuals. Further examination confirmed the blood belonged to 4 victims. In May 2011, Robert was arrested on charges of murdering the Norman family. Despite having significant evidence in the form of the blood found in the garage, the police still lacked a crucial piece: the murder weapon. Robert continued to vehemently deny his guilt, leaving the investigation on edge. But then, an unexpected twist emerged. A fellow inmate who shared a cell with Robert claimed that Robert had confided in him about the events of that fateful night. And what did he disclose? According to this cellmate, on the night of the killings, Robert had slipped some sleeping pills into his wife Casey's drink to ensure she would fall asleep. Then, he armed himself with a pre-prepared weapon and made his way to the Norman residence. His first move was to cut the power, and then he broke in, systematically killing each family member one by one. These details sounded quite convincing, yet the problem was that it was Robert's unofficial confession, which couldn't be used in court as evidence. Though the blood found in the garage became a crucial piece of evidence against Robert, he continued to assert his innocence. Lengthy legal proceedings dragged on, and then a new sensational revelation emerged. Brenda became the star witness. She personally appeared in court to testify and reveal the true nature of her uncle Robert. Brenda shared that ever since she had moved in with her uncle, he had subjected her to harassment. However, she had kept this hidden for a long time, fearing that her confession might hurt her aunt, who remained her only relative and cared for her after the tragedy. It was a fierce and dirty legal battle that lasted a full 7 years and 6 months. Finally, in January 2017, Robert was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment, the highest penalty. Despite years of denial, when the final verdict was delivered, Robert, strangely enough, remained completely calm. But what was his motive for murder? That remains a mystery, as Robert refuses to admit his guilt. However, according to prosecutors and criminal psychologists, it all boils down to envy and jealousy. Robert claimed he worked in China as a luthier, yet when the police checked his background, no records were found to support his claims. Moreover, the very decision to abandon such a prestigious profession and emigrate to Australia appeared suspicious. After moving to Australia, Robert attempted to launch a restaurant business, but the venture failed. Eventually, Robert received financial assistance from his wife's brother, Norman, and relocated to Sydney. Despite the move, he remained unemployed for an extended period. Within Norman's family, Robert was constantly compared to the successful Norman, with his wife's parents praising their accomplished son and treating Robert with disdain. To add insult to injury, after yet another failed business attempt, Robert and his wife found themselves working in Norman's store, a situation that likely left Robert feeling humiliated, as though he had become a subordinate. These circumstances may have driven Robert to the decision to eliminate Norman and his family, but he didn't stop there. He also secured custody of Brenda, which granted him access to the family's inheritance. Following the tragedy, Robert took control of the store and continued to operate it until his arrest, effectively becoming the primary beneficiary in this scenario. Based on all the facts, it appears to be a meticulously planned crime, executed with the intent to seize Norman's assets and those of his family. Moreover, Robert crossed all moral lines when he targeted his own niece. This individual had completely lost his sense of dignity and conscience. In February 2021, Robert, still maintaining his innocence, filed an appeal, but it was rejected. Meanwhile, Brenda, in one of her interviews, recalled the morning she left for a school trip. Like many teenagers, she said a restrained goodbye to her father, unaware that it would be their last meeting. Brenda's greatest regret to this day is that she didn't hug her father that day. She couldn't tell him she loved him, and as she recounted this, she broke down in tears. Even sadder in this story is that Norman, who not only strove to provide for his family but also aimed to bring his relatives to a better life, ultimately faced betrayal. His desire to help turned against him in the most brutal way. What was meant to be an act of kindness returned to Norman as a monstrous revenge, fueled by the envy of a close relative. This betrayal leaves a deep wound. This case is a tragedy in every sense.